everybody, and welcome back. Today we are going to be covering life course theory, which was authored by Sampson and Lobb in 1993. So, in order to develop their theory, Sampson and Lobb analyzed a very famous data set that has been used time and time again to measure delinquency and to test all sorts of research questions about juvenile offending. And that study is the famous data set by Gluck and Gluck. I believe they were a married couple. It's a weird name. It reminds me of like dropping something into water. Gluck, Gluck. But anyway, Gluck and Gluck, very famous study. They had 1,000 juveniles in their data set. And this was a longitudinal study. And longitudinal studies are really a gold standard because you get to see trends over very long periods of time. They're very expensive to do, which means they're not terribly common. So, when we say longitudinal, it might be a study over the course of 30 years where they look at that same group of 1,000 people as juveniles, as adolescents, as adults, and we say, what were the crime rates here? What about at this age? What about at this age? And we see the trends. So it is during looking at some of the trends that came out of this very famous study by Gluck and Gluck that Sampson and Lobb developed their life course theory. They argue that life is dynamic, and that is most definitely true, right? Dynamic meaning that life is full of change, right? And that criminal engagement is dynamic, and it can start or stop depending on where you are in the life course. Life course sounds like this sort of sterile term, I don't know, but really it just means, from when you were born until when you die, right? And a lot of stuff happens between there, right? We change, we grow, we develop, we have different interests, we have different stages of life, and that's what we mean when we refer to the life course. You need to know the term desistance because that is a term specific to Sampson and Lobb that they use. And desistance means stopping engagement in deviance from adolescence into adulthood. And that is very specific, okay? Meaning that you were offending as an adolescent, but once you made it to adulthood, you stopped, you desisted, you no longer offend anymore. Okay, so you need to be, when I say desistance, we're talking about adolescents who used to commit crime and now they're adults and they don't anymore and they're not going to. Okay, so please be aware of that. But the question for Sampson and Lobb was, what causes desistance? Right? Some people who are adolescents who offend end up adults and they stop offending. Other people who are adolescents who offend make it to adulthood and they become adult criminals. And their question is, what's the difference? Why does one group stop offending and the other continues throughout their life course? So one of the biggest findings of their research and one of the biggest postulates of their theory is that delinquency is the best predictor of adult criminality, and that holds very true from 1993 to 2022. People who engage in delinquency, chronic delinquency, are notably more likely to become adult offenders when they reach the age of the majority. What may start out as minor delinquency, minor acts of delinquency, has a high likelihood or a high possibility of becoming serious offending as an adult. So delinquency is a big deal, right? If we can stop it before you reach the age of majority, well, we save a lot of taxpayer money and time. Law enforcement resources can go elsewhere, and you have a better life, right? And certainly we save other people from victimization. So it's important. So Sampson and Lobb say life can change in one of two ways. There are two things that happen to all of us. They are trajectories and transitions. So I'm going to define each and we'll go from there. So first, trajectories. Trajectories are the different roles we assume with age. So as we grow and we go throughout life, we have different roles. I mean, at one point, you're somebody's little girl or a little boy, you're a sibling, right? You might go from a sibling, and then you become college age, and now you're not just a sibling to your, genetic family. You might join a fraternity and become a sibling to a fraternity brother, or sister, a sorority sister. Then after college, your roles change. You are a young professional making a living, entering the work world. You may become a spouse, you may become a parent, you may become a grandparent, right? Depending on what stage of the life course you are in. Those roles are dynamic, they change, right? As we get older. So those are trajectories. Transitions, according to Sampson and Lobb, happen in tandem with changing trajectories. So transitions are life events that precipitate role change. So it's those events in life that literally spark or provoke your change in a role. So this is going to be like graduating high school, graduating college, entering the military, getting married, becoming a parent, and having a child. All of these things are transitions. Right, all of these things are transitions. So we're going to get back to transitions and trajectories, but I do want to talk a little bit about something called informal control, because informal social control, because it is central to life course theory. So, for example, informal social control, we have formal social control, which are our laws, law enforcement arresting people, the correctional, department applying sanctions to people who have broken the law. That's formal social control. Informal social control is different. It's not codified. It's not legal in any capacity. It is literally the social control that we all exert on each other by giving negative feedback and undesirable behaviors. Anything from you just burped in public and I gave you a dirty look to you just cut in line and I said, "Excuse me, there's a line." Right? None of these things are breaking the law, but it does control behavior. Why does it control behavior? Because when people push back, the person who is on the receiving end is meant to feel shame and embarrassment. They don't always feel shame and embarrassment, but they typically do. And that's the power and the strength of informal social control is I'm not calling the police and having you arrested and having you thrown in jail, but I am going to call you out in public and shame you and embarrass you so you'll stop the bad behavior. And typically, most people will stop the bad behavior. Informal social control is a very powerful thing. So there are various informal social control is, when you travel down those transitions and your trajectories change, you change your roles, and these are things you don't want to lose. Like I got in college, I was more risk taking. I did a lot of, I experimented with drugs. I drank a lot of alcohol. I was intoxicated in public a lot. I made some bad decisions, did some stupid stuff. But now I'm 25 and I have my first job, a career job, and I don't want to lose it. It pays me well. It's a great opportunity. It's given me great experience for future opportunities. I don't want to lose it. So I'm not going to drink so hard and I'm not going to experiment with drugs and I'm not going to make those bad decisions and do those stupid things I did in college. Right? That would be a demonstration of informal social control and how it changes as we age through the life course. So there's also something called social capital. And social capital is the notion that the quality of interpersonal relationships build resources for people to draw on. Okay. The greater the amount of resources or social capital you have, the more you're going to conform. Because anytime you deviate into crime, you're going to risk social capital. You're going to risk relationships. You might risk losing a spouse or a significant other, losing friendships, your parents not wanting to be around you or cutting you out of the family, your boss saying, "Look, you do a good job, but you broke the law, and I can't have an employee who's getting arrested." Right? You risk social capital. Right? So pretty much what Sampson and Lobb say, the people who have life trajectories that hit these different transitions, and there are specific transitions, these are the ones who desist criminality. These are the ones who engaged as a juvenile in bad behavior, but then they had a turning point, and that's a really important phrase in this theory. They had a turning point where something changed in their life, and they developed a bond that reduced criminality. But if those bonds were broken, that could destabilize them and send them back to criminality. So what do I mean by this? Let me give you an example of the trajectory, the transition, the turning point, and the social capital all coming together to keep people from engaging in crime. So, for example, marriage, right? A really sort of stereotypical example of, the bad boy, and he's in high school, he's always getting into trouble, and then he falls in love, right? And he falls in love with a female who is a conformist. She doesn't break the law, and she's like, "Look, I love you, but I can't be with somebody who's going to constantly get arrested." They get married, and he's still getting into a little bit of trouble, and she said, "Hey, either this stops or I hit the road." Right? Marriage is social capital. You are now going through life as a team. It's you and someone else, economically, emotionally, socially. Right? Losing that partner means you lose social capital. You lose some of that money. You lose that social support, that emotional support. You don't want to risk it. Marriage becomes a turning point. because it increases your social capital. It changes your it's a transition, changes your trajectories, changes your roles. And we find that there are specific transitions and trajectories that result in desistance from crime. It provokes those turning points away from juvenile criminality into conformity as an adult. And they are as follows. I already mentioned one, marriage. Military, entering the military is another. That you were a juvenile, you're always getting into trouble, and now you go into the military, which is a very strict, regimented institution full of discipline and consequences, where there is no wiggle room for misbehavior. So you have to clean up your act, right? And I've heard many, many, many of my military students say, I was a boy or I was a girl when I went in and I came out a man and I came out a woman, right? That is very much a turning point, and that there is pride involved in being a member of the military, serving the United States and a branch of the military, and that you have social capital in your fellow partners in arms. They rely on you. They need to be able to rely on you. You want them to trust you and be able to rely on you, because if not, then there's shame. You're a bad Marine. You're a bad whatever, right? So marriage, military. Another one is parents, becoming a parent, right? Deciding to have kids, or even if it wasn't planned and you have a child and you say, okay, I have a wildly different transition. That was a huge different transition. It's going to change my trajectory. I went from just being an individual to now I'm a parent. There's a whole other living being that is dependent on me for everything, right? For food, for security, for safety, for guidance, for love, for shelter, all of it. And that is a huge role change. And that is, so it's marriage, it's parenting, it's military, are the first three that we see. We see our juvenile delinquents hit those turning points, change their trajectories through the transitions of marriage, military, etc. And the final and the fourth one is college. We see that people, couldn't get it together. These young kids were always getting into trouble, and all of a sudden they stop offending, right? They stop offending and they say, why? Well, you went to college, right? And college, you either structure yourself, you do your work, you discipline yourself to do your work and get good grades, or college doesn't work. You're going to flunk out, right? So you have to find a way to structure and discipline your life. These are all the turning points that result in desistance. We see that all the people who offended, or a great proportion of the people who offended as juveniles, as they get into adulthood and they keep offending, never went into the military. They never went to college. They never got married. They never became parents, which means they never had those turning points, and they never developed the social capital that comes out of those turning points and those transitions. So what are the policy implications here? Well, the policy implications actually speak out really heavily against long prison sentences. Mandatory minimums, life sentences are a bad thing, according to Sampson and Lobb. That look, if you arrest somebody at 17, 19, 20, whatever, for whatever their crime is, and you say, hey, mandatory minimum, you're going to spend the next 25 years in prison. Guess what? They don't have the opportunity for transitions. There will be no role changes, because if you're in prison, you're not meeting your significant other. You're not becoming a parent. You're not developing a career. You're not going to college. And all of those things that become turning points and that build social capital are literally off the table. And when you get released from prison at 57 years old, it's really hard to start going to college. You can't go into the military at 57. It's very difficult to get married and to start a family when you're that old and when you've been out of society for that long. So mandatory minimums, life sentences, three strikes laws, things of that nature, capital punishment, right? Misdirected according to Sampson and Lobb. That if you are locked up during the years when the turning points change the transitions, which alter the roles, which will ultimately lead to you desisting from crime, if you're in prison all of those years, all of those decades, none of this can happen, right? So we need to step away from those mandatory, exceptionally long-term sentences. It doesn't allow for the natural progression and development in the life course to occur, which will naturally build social capital and naturally result in crime desistance.